Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sam Bruchhaus, and welcome back to the Class Play podcast. As we have done the past 2 weeks, the Class Play is going to focus on the top four quarterbacks expected to define this draft class. We're narrowing it down to QB2 this week, Jayden Daniels from LSU. This podcast will be a companion piece to the written series on SumerSports.com that we've been doing, the tour of the top four. The article about Jayden Daniels will be coming soon, probably at the end of this week. And as always, joining me today are Tage Seth and Ben Brown. Tage, we'll hit you first. How you doing, man?
I'm doing good. I'm staying at my friend's place right now, so not having the home field advantage. So I apologize if my audio is a little bit off, but I'm excited to talk about your guy Jayden Daniels today.
Awesome, man. Ben, how you feeling?
I'm doing good. Yeah, like I said off air, we kind of have shifted focus, so I feel like we're like fully on the downstretch for the NFL draft, and I'm looking forward to it. Lots of big things in the works at Sumer Sports, which I'm excited to kind of dive into over the next couple of weeks. So,
Yep, lots of big things and exciting to be in this last final stretch moving towards the NFL draft. As Tage alluded to, today we're going to be talking Jayden Daniels. I'm notorious for having a very early prediction that Jayden Daniels is going to win the Heisman. I think it was after like the Florida State game where technically he was on the downswing, and I'm like, this dude is just running all over the place and has total control of this LSU offense that seems to have a lot of talent. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with him. But first word, guys, let's describe Jayden Daniels in a single word. What would that word be for you, Tage?
Yeah, I mean, first off, I do vividly remember that text I got from you predicting Jayden Daniels would not only win Heisman, but also challenge Caleb Williams for number one overall. But I think, he's at a point where he might go in the top three here. So you called that out very early, which is very impressive. But the word that I have for Jayden Daniels is chaotic. And I mean this in both a good and a bad way. You start with the good. LSU had a 17.7% explosive play rate last year, which was the highest in the country. Jayden Daniels obviously played a huge role in that as the quarterback of LSU, but he also had a 14.4% explosive pass rate, which is from StatsBomb, which was the highest of the 8 quarterbacks in this class. Malik Neighbors, Brian Thomas Jr., they help with that for sure. But what Jayden Daniels was able to do with throwing the ball downfield and some of the explosive runs that he broke off made LSU's offense hit the really high end of highs. But then you talk about his pressure to sack ratio, which we're going to get into later. You talk about some of the hits that he took per game where it looked like it might be a game-ending or season-ending injury for him, where he was really putting out his body on the line. Like, you really never knew what was going to happen when you were watching Jayden Daniels command the LSU offense, and that's what made it pretty chaotic to me in general.
Yeah, I have a very similar word. Mine, harkening back to I guess it's Looney Tunes, is Roadrunner. He has those scrambles, almost Reggie Bush-like, where he's going sideline to sideline or squeaking out of traps and things like that. Long bombs to Thomas and Neighbors, but bringing up Thomas and Neighbors, there's also this idea that he has these like cartoonishly good players playing with him. He probably had 3 NFL offensive linemen protecting him. He had 2 basically at this point certified first-round talents, if not first-round picks at wide receiver. And so you get that insanely high pressure to sack ratio. And obviously we've all seen the highlights of him just getting demolished and having that kind of upright running frame that we haven't seen transferred to the NFL for players that remain healthy in a while. So I have that kind of road runner word tagged on him because, as you can say, he can blow it up in a good way and he can get blown up in a bad way. So Ben, what are your thoughts? What's your word for Jayden Daniels?
yeah, I think in a lot of ways we probably are using similar word choices, obviously, for what we're trying to describe. But to me, I think he's really like, you hear the term twitchy basically in a lot of ways. To me, I think everyone kind of knows like he is obviously super athletic. But it feels like it's a little bit different than like the other uber athletic quarterbacks that we've seen previously, thinking guys like Cam Newton, Anthony Richardson, even like in a Michael Vick sort of sense. Like I feel like Vick was this like smooth sort of like top end runner, runner. And I don't really get the same vibes from Jayden Daniels. So I think he's kind of like the quarterback equivalent of being able to like, juke a guy in a phone booth, which was, PFF sold, or former PFF Mike Renner was like his like go-to phrase for a lot of like kind of twitchy type guys who can juke anybody and really close in tight quarters. I think you see that a lot, but he's very much kind of like the explosive play waiting to happen. Like you said, Sam, like, the deep shots, obviously to the NFL caliber receivers that he got to play with, like there was, an explosive play kind of happening on seemingly every single successful drive that the LSU offense had because of him in a lot of ways. And I think that athleticism provides a pretty reasonable floor for what you can expect and how successful he can actually be at the NFL level. And I think given the right scheme, like it's going to provide, a relatively efficient offense when it's all said and done, given the potential weapons that he might find around him.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting. We've covered 2 quarterbacks currently, and J.J. McCarthy obviously had a juggernaut of a team, but realistically, he didn't really have to score all that many points. And Drake May obviously wasn't on the level of team that an LSU was or a Michigan was. But when you look at Jayden Daniels, particularly in his platform year, you have those super talented offensive players, but that defense was just not great last year. And so you really had to see him stretch to win games and stretch his abilities and stretch his offensive playmakers' abilities as well, because they were having to get 40, 50 points a game just to remain competitive. And so when he's having to do that and he's having to stretch his abilities, obviously we start to see some pros and cons. Tage, what are your kind of thoughts about his strengths and weaknesses?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point about how he had to overcome some of his defensive struggles that were happening just to keep LSU in a lot of games. And I think you see that in his pros, like his scramble ability, how he's able to already look for a path out of the pocket when, maybe his first and second read aren't open. Like, I think that was something that was really impressive to me. And just like what he was able to do on those scrambles, 12% scramble rate was the highest of any quarterback in this class. His deep ball accuracy was also something that was very impressive. You're talking about someone who is a 5th-year starter and has improved each year in that category. Deep ball accuracy is somewhat of a wide receiver stat sometimes, just because of the way that they can manipulate at the catch point to come down with some of those. But I think, like, from watching Jayden Daniels in general, you can see that that's something that could carry over to the next level as throws 20 yards and more downfield and how he's able to do that. And I think his height is also something that's going to benefit him in the long run. Like when we ran some of our comps, like Kyler Murray was someone that came up in a very data-based comp just based on his statistical profile in college. But like what he has above Kyler Murray and maybe even Bryce Young is like he's a 70th percentile guy at 6'4", where like he can overcome seeing over his offensive line and not having to get out of the pocket so often. But I think a potential drawback of that in his cons is 13th percentile weight. So he's someone that's going to be very slender in the NFL. You're hoping his health is able to keep up with more of his height and not his weight, because that's something that worries me is being that skinny, especially with how many sacks he took throughout all of college and especially during his platform year. The other slight concern I have is we saw LSU's offense be a mostly outside the numbers offense where he wasn't utilizing the middle of the field much, just because like that's where the strengths were of the weapons on the team. And that's just kind of how the offense was drawn up. So I have a little bit more uncertainty about how he's going to attack the middle of the field, which we know is a very crucial skill in the NFL.
Yeah, you brought up a lot of great points there. You talk about kind of the uncertainty in the middle of the field. I think that's interesting. And Ben's talked a little bit about how, depending on the scheme fit, we could see some differences in how Daniels transfers to the NFL. Ben, what are your thoughts about his strengths and weaknesses, how that transfers to the NFL?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely am in agreement, I would say, with like all of Taja's points. I think in a lot of ways, there's definitely going to be some overlap with all the things we discussed. But like going back to it, like they played, a really difficult SEC schedule, and he did it, without a defense that really didn't get a lot of stops, basically. So I think in a lot of ways, like that showcased his big play type ability out of necessity in a way in which we like just didn't see from JJ McCarthy. But I think going up against like the best defenses in the SEC, the Alabamas of the world, like I think that just speaks to an overall confidence of things that we're not going to get from like a Big Ten quarterback play. So I think that's definitely a pro. Obviously, really elite athlete at the quarterback position. Tage touched on it, the deep ball accuracy. I do think that is in some ways driven by, wide receiver play. And to me, I think one of the biggest concerns, with Jayden Daniels has been, and it's really hard to knock a guy for this sort of environment. And we heard it, previously with Ohio State quarterbacks, but, the elite NFL wide receiver talent he had at kind of both Arizona State and LSU, right? Like he had Brandon Ayuk, first round draft pick at Arizona State in his first 3 seasons. I think like what happens when those sorts of guys are going against NFL level talent that's comparable to them, as opposed to kind of running all over, guys that, are going to be working in other areas outside of the NFL, come Sunday next season. So I think that's somewhat of a concern. Kind of what Tage said, can he hold up? Really slender frame, took a lot of hits. I think a lot of that was because he does rely on his legs a little bit too much under pressure, doesn't really want to seem to throw the football away or keep his eyes downfield when he kind of feels some of that pressure. So I think those are going to need to be some evolutions in this game, not only to, fix a little bit of the sack or the pressure to sack ratio type things, but also just, being willing to keep his eyes downfield because he doesn't need to take as many hits when under pressure. To me, another concern, we talked about this last week with Drake May, but, he is kind of in this older age range, 5th year in college, pre-COVID guy, had multiple stops, basically. Like there's a reason why we're not talking a lot about Jayden Daniels at Arizona State in the similar way that we're not talking about Michael Penix at, Indiana. And I think, some of that going back to our overall desires with some of those quarterback prospects. So I think that can definitely be an overall con. And then, yeah, I think just in general, like, some of the things that you mentioned of him being and throwing over the middle and his ability to actually do that, like Tage said, all of it was essentially production outside the numbers. When he does miss, he does seem to miss high, which can be like an absolute catastrophe over the middle on some of those throws. So I think if he is asked to make some of those NFL type throws, the in-breaking routes at, 15 to 20 yards, like there is going to be a concern about those being relatively accurate or leading to interceptions right away. And I think if that kind of continues to compound, like that's kind of when his confidence goes down the drain. So those are definitely some concerns, but I think overall, like the top end athletic profile is very much going to see him and should see him be relatively successful at the NFL level.
I think both of y'all have hit really well on his strengths, and particularly about his ability to make outside throws. Like he is quite good at that. Obviously the middle is more of a question, but he's shown the ability to make those very long throws, particularly to quick NFL level receivers, which I think kind of boost him to the position that he's at now at QB2. And then obviously that scrambling ability is elite, probably of what we've seen from a prospect, period, included in the Michael Vicks of the worlds and the RG3s of the worlds. Like he's definitely in that tier. The thing from an intangible point of view, and this is just from someone who's from Louisiana and watched a ton of LSU football, has a sister that goes to LSU. And so just kind of being in that is he's shown a ton of growth during his time at LSU. And I think for coaches, at least, that endears him to believe that he will continue to iron out some of these weaknesses that I'll get to in a second and that Ben and Tasha brought up. But when you are able to see a player who was, probably not an NFL quarterback for several years at the beginning of his career at Arizona State, all of a sudden come into a more difficult situation with a new coach. And the first year, there's a lot up in the air with that LSU team. And you're able to see him week by week get better, playing a difficult SEC schedule, obviously get the big win in 2022 against Alabama. I still really didn't think he was an NFL quarterback going into this season. I thought he was at best a backup and maybe just someone who could have some scrambling ability, but I didn't even really think he was a backup at that point. I thought he got sacked way too much, which obviously he still kind of to a certain point does, but I just didn't see it. And then that Florida State game, obviously the game didn't go their way, but I immediately noticed a big difference in what he was doing through the air. And perhaps we chalk that up to a lot of progression with their wide receivers and their offensive line. But week over week building, it was like, okay, this guy is definitely an NFL quarterback. Like he will be drafted, certified, and he will be drafted high. And I think that growth is something very similar to what we kind of saw with Joe Burrow over his 2 years at LSU, and also kind of to a point with Baker Mayfield at Oklahoma. Obviously, those are two certified NFL quarterbacks. There was a little uncertainty with Baker while he was with the Browns, but I think when you can kind of comp back to that growth, it makes you feel a little better if you're picking this team. Another thing that I want to highlight is y'all have mentioned his physical, kind of very lean, but there's a mismatch with how he plays, where he plays almost like a running back, where he's trying to truck people, he's jumping up in the air. There's a lot of interesting things going on with how he plays based on how he's built. And if you read back kind of through the articles, even going back to his freshman year at Arizona State, he's been doing that for a long time. I just don't think that's something that can continue at the NFL level, where the speed is way different.
Yeah, and to even add on to your point about his progression, like I think it's very similar to Jalen Hurts, where I looked at Jalen Hurts until last year, he was someone who got better at football every single year he played, right? Like from when he started at Alabama to when he got to Oklahoma to when he got into the NFL and was able to take that leap from his first year to his second year in the league. Like I think you're hoping that something similar happens to Jayden Daniels, where rushing success is a pretty big predictor of NFL success. It goes back to what we talked about in the last couple of shows, where you can give yourself a longer time frame to figure out the passing, to figure out some of the nuances of the quarterback position when you have your legs to rely on. I think Jalen Hurts is an example of that, as someone who was able to figure out the passing because he had the rushing ability. We talked about Josh Allen being very similar. Like I think if you're the team that ends up taking Jayden Daniels, you're hoping that you get a similar kind of path to success, where he still improves as he gets further into the league. Obviously, he'll be a little bit older than Jalen Hurts when he was drafted, but you still hope for that linear progression. And then you're also hoping like his legs gives him time to figure out some of the other stuff, like throwing over the middle of the field, like you guys brought up.
For sure. And Tej, I think you did a great job of giving like the 30,000-foot view of where Jayden Daniels sits in terms of comparables, in terms of strengths and weaknesses. But obviously, you have to deep dive into the film to get that. So we've all done that for the audience, and we've picked out a couple good games that we think that folks should go watch. We'll start off with you, Ben. Ben, what was the most intriguing game to you that Jayden Daniels played?
Yeah, I would say that I thought this was overall one of the most entertaining football games that we got this college football season, but it was Ole Miss LSU week 5. LSU actually didn't end up winning this football game, went down, right away, obviously going back to a really poor defensive performance from the LSU Tigers, but they were down 14-0, I think, after like one punted offensive possession. Daniels fumbled, I think, on the second drive. And then LSU went for like 6 straight touchdown drives, except for like the ending drive of the first half where they missed a field goal. And it was just all big plays, right? Chunk plays through the ground because of Jayden Daniels, chunk plays through the air. I do think in some ways that game overall epitomizes just this like evaluation of Jayden Daniels and kind of like what is going to translate really well to the NFL level. Because I do think a lot of those big plays, very much created by his wide receivers. And it is difficult to kind of separate those two things. But there's just, play after play of like his highlight reel type ability. And I think overall, like that was kind of like the breakout performance where it was like, this guy can navigate a high octane offense that is going to be one of the most enjoyable things to watch in college football. And I think that was kind of like the breakout performance, which made me say, this is a guy that can not only contribute on Sundays, but could have like a very sizable impact on the outcome of any game he's involved in because of this athletic ability. But then on the downside of that, like the wide receiver play was unbelievable in that game. Towards the end of it, they kind of relied a little bit more on Jayden Daniels' rushing ability, didn't convert when they needed to kind of win that game, gave the ball back to Ole Miss, and the rest was kind of history. So I do think there are kind of two sides to the coin in this evaluation of this game. But I think overall, both the goods and the bads were kind of in a overarching viewpoint of where Jayden Daniels kind of sits as a prospect. And I think you saw a lot of his strengths and also some of his weaknesses. And I think for that reason, like it is a really good evaluation of what he is potentially capable of doing at the NFL level.
Yeah, and I'd like to call out that you picked an SEC game here, and I think you're looking at Drake May, who has a pretty decent usage rate in some of those games, but obviously against ACC opponents, not necessarily to the standard. And then you have McCarthy, who is playing against Big Ten opponents, but has a very, very low usage rate. That Ole Miss game is one where Jayden Daniels' usage rate is on Luka Doncic levels, and also he's playing an SEC opponent like he's playing a certified team that has pumped out NFL players. Tej, I think you also picked some SEC games. What interested you?
Yeah, so I really want to talk about the Alabama 2023 game, but to kind of set the stage and go back to the 2022 game also against Alabama, you talk about one of the best games of that season where Jayden Daniels had an 85.4 QBR going head-to-head against Bryce Young. 3 total touchdowns, was LSU's leading rusher, and then they had that upset ability, that the game that went into overtime, and LSU was able to pull that out. So that really set the stage for Jayden Daniels to go into Tuscaloosa and play against Alabama in 2023. And I think you saw a lot of the stuff that Ben just mentioned in this 2023 game. 97.7 QBR, 3 total touchdowns. Again, was also the team's leading rusher. Again, he's playing against a pretty good Alabama defense. Like Terry and Arnold, Kool-Aid McKinstry are going to go in the first round. Caleb Downs was one of the better safeties in the country last year. The true freshman, Dallas Turner, obviously on the edge. But you also saw where like that injury concern that we all have came into play in this game. Was great quarters 1 through 3. Dallas Turner tipped an interception. Terry Arnold caught it, and the game kind of got a little bit away from LSU. He got hit on the next drive, which was like a pretty hard hit, but he didn't come back into the game after that hit. Like I think that other quarterbacks with bigger frames, Justin Herbert's, the Josh Allens, they might have popped up and been able to continue to play after that, but his smaller frame didn't allow him to. But like a lot of ups and downs in this game in general, the explosiveness, the chaotic nature of how he plays. Like I think you saw all of that. And that 2022 Alabama game might have been a game that put him on the map. And then Sam, like you talked about how you noticed him and how much he improved after the Florida State game this year. And I really think the 2023 Alabama game kind of accumulated all of this together.
Yeah, and I think that's a great game to really view, not only against NFL level talent, or at least NFL prospect level talent, but also like the highs and lows of the Jayden Daniels experience. I went with a game that is just pure Jayden Daniels high. That Georgia State game, I was looking back at like the Heisman moments of players, and I think Jayden Daniels is the only person who's ever had a Heisman moment playing for an SEC team against a Sun Belt team. But you get an 8-touchdown game, and if I'm an NFL coach and I just want an idea of a guy who is hitting on all cylinders with a team, that is what it looks like. And obviously it was an overpowered opponent, but accurate throws, smart running and not getting hit and being slippery, and obviously just putting up sheer statistical magnificence, which I think is kind of the story of his year this year. But if you want to see excellence against a not very good team, check out that Georgia State LSU game, because Jayden Daniels puts on a show.
It's exactly what I do with my quarterback in Road to Glory. Once I reach a high enough level where like I can call my own plays, like the running back gets 0 design carries the entire game, right? Like I'm just trying to stat pad as much as I can, and Jayden Daniels was building up his Heisman resume to really clinch the award that game, which made it really fun to watch that Saturday night.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned that Road to Glory. In a lot of cases, Jayden Daniels' usage was almost as if someone was controlling him and just trying to win the Heisman, except he was having to do it to win games, and he was doing it in real life, obviously. And so talking about like video game level output, obviously a lot of times we're comparing players and we can switch them out in Madden or switch them out in NCAA, but in the draft, those player comparables are generally very important to communicate what you think about a player. And so, Tej, what are your thoughts about kind of a player comparable that may be close to Jayden Daniels?
Yeah, so I talked about a little bit earlier how like he is taller than Kyler Murray, which I think like separates them a little bit. But I still think from like a play style standpoint, you're going to see some similarities in the NFL with how Jayden Daniels is viewed as I think people view Kyler Murray right now. Like the way he dances around the pocket, like Ben mentioned, kind of like maneuvering his way out of certain tackles. He might still end up taking the sack, but at least he's trying to buy himself some time. I think his quick scramble ability is something that's really impressive. There's different types of scramblers. When I talk about like someone like Josh Allen or Jalen Hurts, like it's more fluid, it's more power running where they kind of can take off with the ball, very like Colin Kaepernick like. But like Kyler Murray, Jayden Daniels, even Patrick Mahomes to an extent, like when they scramble, it's very quick movements. Like they're trying to get to the sideline and get that yards that they needed. So I think that's also something he's very similar to Kyler Murray in. And then the overarching theme of health for both of these quarterbacks, where I love when both of them are on the field. I'm a little bit worried about their sustainability long term and whether they can play consistent 17-game full regular seasons. And so like I hope that both of them can stay healthy, but I'm always going to have a little bit more of an injury concern for them versus other quarterbacks in the league.
Yeah, I like that you kind of touched on the Colin Kaepernick. Obviously he's the same height as Colin Kaepernick, and I think we all remember Colin Kaepernick as kind of a skinny guy, obviously a new wave quarterback at the time, but that guy was like 230. Like he was very large and was absolutely throwing rockets. And that's what kind of like, that's why I kind of moved away from it. But Ben, you also made a comp to a bigger player. What were your thoughts?
Yeah, I said smaller Anthony Richardson, and maybe I shouldn't have said it from like a height standpoint, but very much kind of, the size weight aspect. I do think he's maybe a little bit quicker than Anthony Richardson. To me, I feel like the twitchiness that I described earlier is almost reminiscent more of like a Lamar Jackson type. To me, I don't know if he's quite there from an athletic standpoint or profile. So I do think just like a slightly smaller Anthony Richardson. I think in a lot of ways, the offense that he lands, and I'm hoping is similar to what they try to run with Anthony Richardson in Indianapolis, with Shane Steichen the first 5 games of the season. I think that's overall going to be the ideal offensive scheme fit for Jayden Daniels. So that's kind of why I went with that comp. I'm not sold on like a lot of the other ones that we're seeing thrown around there. So I'd be interested to kind of hear your thoughts on it, Sam. But to me, he's kind of unique in his own way. I do see some remnants of Kyler Murray and Lamar Jackson. I'm not quite sure if the top end is as high as those guys are, though.
Yeah, I struggled to come up with kind of a size, height, weight, whatever comparison in terms of the physical. Obviously, quarterback is a little less of a quote physical position. Obviously, you don't want to get hurt, but we've seen a Drew Brees who's 5'11" and up in his 40s playing, and we've seen the classic Peyton Manning, 6'5", 240, Eli Manning, that build work. But when I really kind of thought about what I expect him to do at the NFL level, I really couldn't get away from kind of the play style of Michael Vick. Now, obviously, Mike Vick, basically until his years in Philadelphia, was not playing in a league, much less a system that allowed him to really have designed runs. But he made his money on throws, like big time throws to the outside, and really letting his wide receivers go under the ball and make plays and scrambling. And I think I initially shied away because I'm like, okay, Mike Vick's a legend. And to Tej's earlier point, he's a video game type player. And I think to a certain extent, Jayden Daniels is probably an NFL video game type player. But when you look at Mike Vick, I'm just looking at NFL Elo, nfelo.com. I think it's technically .app. But when you're looking at, points over the average starter, which is based off of 538 model, basically until Mike Vick was in Philly, he was never over, 8th in points over average starter in that metric. And a lot of the other advanced metrics were not super kind to him either. And I think, he was getting MVP votes. Obviously, it's a different time. And we saw him in 2010 and 2011 really getting that top 5. And I think that's kind of how we can expect Jayden Daniels to be at the next level of a player who, is very fun to watch, does a lot of good things, But really, he's probably going to struggle over the middle. And the things that you really have to do to be a championship level quarterback or a Tom Brady legend, he's probably not going to be great at. But the things that make him a fun player and a good starter, he'll be good at. And he'll have a couple of years where he'll pop up and lead a really good team and have some really good statistics. So that's why I went with Michael Vick there. Obviously, Michael Vick's a different type of athlete in terms of 5'10", 5'11", 210, 220. Jayden Daniels obviously kind of the flip of that, but I think the impact is very similar. And speaking of impact, obviously he's going to go to a team, and the NFL scheme is so important. Tage, what are your thoughts about Jayden Daniels' scheme fit?
Yeah, so I kind of had a little bit of a tougher time placing him than some of the other quarterbacks we've talked about, just because, like you mentioned, Sam, like it's really tough to come up with a comp for him. Like I think he's very unique in regards to quarterback prospects that we've seen in the last couple of years. I kind of have two teams that I would like to see him on, but for two different reasons. One is the Patriots, because I think that we've seen the Patriots not really invest a ton in receiver. So I think like it could be mutually beneficial for both sides, where Jayden Daniels can help them out with his scrambling ability when these receivers might not necessarily be getting open that often. They have an offensive line he can do some design rushing stuff behind, and I think that they're going to be pretty physical in that regard, and the run game can be pretty dynamic with him there. And then as they add receivers, he can grow as a passer. Going back to the Jalen Hurts example, like when the Eagles added AJ Brown. But another team that I think would be really cool to see him on is the Giants, because he doesn't necessarily have to start there right away. Like they can still give Daniel Jones the preference. And we saw what they were able to do with Daniel Jones, who is an above average rushing quarterback, but not like a top 5 talent from a rushing standpoint. Like 2 seasons ago, with just like how much fun that offense was able to be with him. Ben, I apologize for bringing up this game, but like you think about the Vikings wild card game and like how Daniel Jones was able to run for so many yards in that game. And like I think that Brian Dable and his offensive staff can do some fun stuff with Jayden Daniels in the run game if he goes there as well.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. Ben, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I do really like that. I went more with like a team-based fit with the surrounding pieces that would be available to Jayden Daniels. So I do think the Commanders make a lot of sense. I think, scary Terry McLaurin, I would say kind of the perfect complement for what he needs from like a downfield receiving threat. Can separate, I would say, at the point of catch. And I think in a lot of ways, if they got a decent second guy, Jahan Dotson as a 3, like that's a pretty intriguing starting spot. Obviously, Cliff Kingsbury getting a second chance with a dynamic quarterback. You can think what you want about, the Kingsbury situation. To me, I don't think there's been enough done to really understand how, some of these like retreat head coaching options do once they're kind of back at a coordinator position. But I think I would generally lean in the direction of experience, at least benefiting them. And I do think Kingsbury kind of learning from his mistakes, like he could at least somewhat unlock Jayden Daniels to be successful given the kind of the environment around him. So I do think it's Commanders. I think it would be difficult for me to see him sitting right away. And I think it would also be difficult for him to be in a situation where I'm not as sold that they're going to be able to at least compete for a divisional crown in like the next 2 years. And I don't think you can say those sorts of things for, teams like the Patriots and the Raiders and some of these other guys that have been linked to Jayden Daniels lately.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. I really like the Commanders, and I think the Cliff Kingsbury fact is interesting because, you think to yourself, Jayden Daniels, who can scramble and we know can pitch it around from the pocket to good receivers, seems like a great fit for an air raid type NFL hybrid offense. But I consulted with our resident film expert, Sean Syed, and was like, hey, man, I didn't get the chance to watch a ton of Cliff Kingsbury, Arizona film back when he was there. What were your kind of thoughts on how he transferred to the NFL? And he said, I like what he did, but I felt like he really struggled against NFL level schemed pressure. And that's like kind of a major red flag for Daniels. As we know, he has a pretty rough pressure to sack ratio. An interesting note kind of separate to that in terms of play callers is you look at like a Desmond Ridder, who was also coached by Mike Denbrock, at Cincinnati. Mike Denbrock, obviously the offensive coordinator, now at Notre Dame, was previously at LSU with Brian Kelly. They both had a very similar pressure sack ratio. So I think scheme, honestly, is something very interesting, especially with a lack of play action, as LSU had last year. And I think if you get him kind of in that play action offense, it'd be very interesting to see what happened. That's why I also thought he'd be an interesting fit with the Bears, given that Shane Waldron has, really gotten the maximum out of a Geno Smith and had two good wide receivers with the Seahawks, and obviously coming into a situation where they have DJ Moore and probably will be able to draft another good wide receiver if they so elect to. I feel like the Bears probably have a better offensive line situation than the Commanders, at least that we've seen. Commanders bringing in a lot of new guys. Another one I just wanted to note because it kind of shocked me, obviously, on Instagram Live, Malik Neighbors and Jayden Daniels were talking a day or two ago, and Malik Neighbors said that he's likely to go to his homies, and a lot of people took that a lot of different ways, but obviously Daniels, close to Antonio Pierce, was part of that Herm Edwards staff at Arizona State. Would be interesting to see if the Raiders are willing to test the waters and trade up and move up for him. Obviously, the Raiders were not a great team this year and don't project, at least, to be a great team next year in their current format. But it'd be interesting to see them in silver and black, and obviously on the West Coast, and to see what they can do in that indoor stadium. So we've talked a little bit about where they fit. Let's say they go into those fits. What do you think the final destination is for Jayden Daniels, Tage?
So I think in 4 years, we're going to be looking at Jayden Daniels the same way that we were looking at Justin Fields after this season, where I think he's going to show a ton of flashes, especially in the run game, but even with the deep ball accuracy that we were talking about earlier, I think that, either there could be a million reasons for this, but maybe it's injuries, maybe it's coaching staff. Like he's going to get held back a little bit. That's just a function of being drafted in the top 5. Sean Syed and I talked about the loser's curse a little bit on Stats and Scheme earlier this week. So I think like you're going to be looking at someone who ranks between like 14th and 20th in EPA per play, after his third or fourth season. And you're going to be wondering, like, should we be drafting a quarterback at number 9 overall? Should we be rolling with Jayden Daniels for one more year? I think there's going to be a very big debate among whatever fan base has Jayden Daniels and like what to do with him after this year. And I think like all of that stuff that Justin Fields kind of showed his last 2 years in Chicago might be pretty similar to what Jayden Daniels shows his last 2 years in whatever city he ends up getting drafted to.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Ben, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think Justin Fields is a really good comp. I went more with like a similar trajectory to Anthony Richardson, but obviously we haven't seen him play out a whole lot, but obviously injured in year 1. The question is going to be like how he performs or sets up to expectation in year 2. But I think both those guys, really heavily dependent on situation, offensive play caller, for how they are going to progress. I do think in a lot of ways, like even going back to it, like there was a time where Lamar Jackson, even though he, was had won, an MVP in 2019, like there was questions about if he could fit in with various teams, especially if he was a free agent. And it does seem like we're probably going to move further in the direction where these guys can fit almost anywhere. But I do think those questions are still going to harp or continue to kind of like lay claim. And I think overall, if they're not quite as good as someone, if he doesn't quite live up to that Lamar Jackson type expectation, then there are going to be questions of whether he, should get a long-term second-year contract or not. So I think there's a lot of questions still surrounding the situation and where he ends up. But I think that's going to be probably overall like what we kind of hear even after his first 3 to 4 seasons, and like a suggestion that he will get a 5th-year option, but there is like a legitimate question as far as like if he should get that second-term contract with the team that he finds himself on.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And you bring up Lamar Jackson. I think it's a bridge too far to say that he will reach. Obviously, a lot of people are comping him to Lamar Jackson. I think it's a bridge too far to say that he will reach the heights. But in terms of like heavily dependent on scheme, Lamar Jackson has really benefited from the ways that the Ravens have tried to put him in a position to succeed. I think Daniels may actually have the ability to go outside of like a great scheme fit, because I think he can throw okay, and I think he can be a pretty good pocket passer. Someone that I had an eye on that I thought was interesting would be like a Dak Prescott type loop, where he's a guy that people think is a good quarterback, but they don't necessarily trust, and there's a lot of questions about every year. I think Dak probably silenced some of those last year, but harkening back to my Michael Vick point, I think Jayden Daniels may be a player who is similar to a kind of Kirk Cousins, Dak Prescott career trajectory, where everyone thinks they're, decent quarterbacks, but there's constantly thoughts about whether or not you can upgrade. And obviously both of those players make a ton of money right now. But I think that's kind of an interesting loop, especially given that, early season, mid-season, he was still in that kind of second round, third round view, basically until he performed extremely well against SEC play and vaulted into the top 2, top 3 conversation. And so I'd be interested to see how that kind of progresses if he does end up being a very good player, if there's kind of a constant thought process that maybe you can improve or maybe there's something else you can do. But it's difficult in the NFL, and he probably will end up getting paid a ton of money if he performs to that level. So that's kind of my thoughts there. That concludes kind of our view of Jayden Daniels. As always, we've been going through our class play picks, where we pick some of our favorite draftees from previous drafts. We've done running back, defensive line, wide receiver, corners, offensive linemen, and safeties. Before we get to quarterbacks next week, we're going with my favorite position, the position that I played, and that is off-ball linebacker. Ben, who's one of your favorite off-ball linebacker draftees?
I mean, I went with Luke Kuechly, legend of the game, basically, former Panthers. I'm trying to build a dynasty defensively. I'm trying to prove that, defense does matter and can win championships. So if I have Ed Reed solidifying my back end, I feel like I have one of the strongest middle combinations, maybe better than the Ray Lewis, Ed Reed days. I'm not quite sure, but I went with Luke Kuechly. I was going to go with Ray Lewis, but times are tough, basically. So I went with the Panthers, I guess, for sure. So I don't mind it. I still need to go back and fill in the rest of my roster, but I would say there's an emphasis on speed and athletic ability for sure.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And Luke Kuechly, is the godfather of the white linebacker wearing number 59, as I was, the white linebacker
Legend.
wearing number 59. So big shout out to Luke Kuechly as trailblazing for guys like me. Tage, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, Sam, I would have picked you if you ended up getting drafted. I think NFL teams missed on you. So, unfortunately, I had to settle for Manti Te'o here, who, even before I think a lot of the off-field stuff happened, like I thought he was an awesome player. I thought, how much he was representative of his culture and, was able to kind of show the country, his background, I thought was always really cool when I was younger, but even like on the field, like tackling machine, someone who played in some really big moments. And then obviously the catfishing scandal happened. I was telling Ben this, but like everything I learned about Christianity growing up was from Tim Tebow, and like everything I learned about catfishing was from Manti Te'o. Like I didn't know what the term was before him. Obviously I'm more aware of it now, but like just like everything he had to go through to end up getting to the NFL, like how SportsCenter would basically open up their show every morning talking about him, like such an interesting prospect. And I think he went on to have like an okay NFL career, probably not as good as his college career, like what you might have expected from him in college, but still very impressive that he was able to do everything he did with kind of like everything that surrounded him.
Yeah, one of my favorite parts about this segment is that we've really gotten to see how times have changed through the lens of sports. And I think Manti Te'o is a great one, obviously, because, players on social media all the time, we see all kinds of interesting things pop up about how players are handling their social media. And Manti Te'o, I think, was one of those first where it went, ultra nuclear, extremely big, happening while he's on the podium at the Heisman Trophy ceremony. And, we look back on that now as kind of a harbinger of what was to come. And now really players have to really check what they're doing on social media, but basically on a daily basis, who they're talking to. I think there's a lot better management of it, probably being taught all the way down from, high school to the NCAA and so on. But Teo, great Notre Dame legend, loved that big Oklahoma win while he was at Notre Dame. And also, I don't know if we can call him a Saints legend, but definitely a guy who contributed to the Saints. I had a couple for off-ball linebackers. I have to give a huge shout out to my boy Dorian Williams, who I played with. I almost picked him, but thought didn't want to go with the homer pick. Then I kind of was looking through some drafts. Heartbreakingly, I wanted to pick Zaven Collins, who had a pick 6 in overtime to basically kick us out of the American Conference Championship picture. They ended up going to play Cincinnati in the American Conference Championship. Interesting player, off ball, on ball, did a lot of cool things at Tulsa, ended up being a very high draft pick. I'm going with someone who really endeared himself to me through his play and made me want to be a defensive player. And I'm going with Scooby Wright out of Arizona. Probably not a name that a ton of people know at this point in 2024, but won a ton of awards at Arizona. I was like so heartbroken when he went in the 7th round. And I had no idea why he was going in the 7th round. I thought he was such a good player. Obviously didn't do a ton in the NFL, but a great college player and a player that I was like, why aren't a younger me or much younger me was thinking, why aren't these teams picking this guy higher? I mean, he has the heart of a champion. And obviously now I work in draft analysis, and I understand why that is the way it has to be at the NFL level. And so he's an interesting pick, and I think we all have some pretty good teams going now, and I'm excited to see who we pick with quarterback next week.
Spring football legend Scooby Wright. So he had an illustrious XFL career, I think it was. XFL, USFL, I'm not quite sure, but he was well thought of in those streets at least. So I love the pick, Sam. I love the pick.
That's a great one.
Definitely. So to the audience, thank you for joining us. As always, you'll be able to listen to this podcast elsewhere on any podcast platform you'd like. Keep an eye out for the Jayden Daniels article coming soon. And from Ben Brown, Tej, Seth, Sam Bruchhaus, and the rest of Sumer Sports, thank you for watching.